Women of Welcome. I know this is a little bit unexpected. We didn't make any announcements about this, but we are going to talk about some things tonight that might be on your mind. A couple of days ago, I had posted a video just saying, hey, these are some headlines that are going to come out that we're going to start to see, and they shouldn't frighten us, and that we're not frightened at all. So I'm going to, hold on one second. I'm going to go with Soerens, who hopefully is going to come on here in just any second. But there's Matt.
Hey.
Everyone say hi to Matthew Soerens, our trusted friend, like one of the few men we allow into the Women of Welcome community.
The high honor.
Yeah, how are we doing?
I think I figured out Instagram Live, so I feel like we're doing well.
All right, so this is a great start. So I was just telling the ladies a couple of days ago, if you're just joining us, I had mentioned, you're going to start to see some headlines. We're anticipating some headlines, and we're not afraid, and you shouldn't be either. But some of the headlines can seem a little bit scary, maybe make us a little bit nervous. Some of us who are in the Women of Welcome community have legitimate fears and are still trying to figure out this nuance between being a welcoming country, being a welcoming people of God, but also feeling safe and secure, and being good stewards of what the Lord has given us in the United States. So we believe that we can live in that tension, and we can do it well. We can do it better. And I think as Christians, we must do it better. So Matt and I are here to talk about four specific things tonight that we know you're going to be seeing, things we anticipate you're probably going to be hearing about. I'm sure there's going to be lots of social sharing of these headlines. And the reason why we're getting on tonight is because we want to equip you to understand some of the nuances in these headlines that you're going to see, and just equip you to not be afraid, and to tell you that we're not afraid. And this is why we exist. So World Relief is our supporting partner, and Matthew is an executive director there and good friends. So these are the four things we're going to talk about. We are going to cover caravans. There's been a lot of headlines about caravans lately. We're going to talk about open borders, and is that a legitimate policy or conversation that is going to come up? We're also going to talk about that in a little bit in conjunction with border security. We're going to talk about, with a Biden administration, are we going to go back to a kind of a catch and release type policy or situation when it comes to admitting or vetting immigrants in our country? And then the last thing is kind of the most popular thing other than the caravan conversation that's going on is Biden has proposed an immigration reform policy that he would like to push specifically, I think, for Dreamers and DACA recipients and those with temporary protected status. So Matthew's going to tell us a little bit about that, or at least what he knows about that, or what we can tell so far. So let's start with caravans. There's been a lot of headlines, Matthew, about folks that are coming up from Honduras. If those of us who have seen the headlines of a lot of police pushing back, Guatemalan police and Honduras police pushing back on, they said a caravan of about 7,000 people. So first of all, let's talk about what do we know about caravans first. Not necessarily this one, but what do we know about caravans and in conjunction with new administrations and whatnot? Tell us.
Yeah, I think to go way back, just the idea of a caravan is people traveling together. It's not an inherently scary idea. There's a few caravans in the Bible and times when people were traveling together, usually for safety, right? if you think about when Jesus and his family went to the temple, they were traveling in such a large group that his parents didn't notice he wasn't among them for, I forget if it was a few days before they realized, wait, where's Jesus? So caravans are how people travel, especially when they want to be protected in a large group. And there's a few things, that the idea of a caravan is you're not necessarily hiring a smuggler who's going to protect you and bring you across a dangerous journey. You're going to rely on safety and numbers. What caravans are not is a great strategy to sneak into any country. If you think about that, if your goal is to sneak into the United States, you don't ask 1,000 of your friends to come with you. It makes it a little bit harder. So these people who, frankly, very likely may not make it to the United States border, as we've seen, they're being stopped by the Guatemalan government from Honduras. They're likely to face a lot of challenges by the Mexican government. And some of that is policies that have been in place under some pressure from the U.S. government, but also COVID-19. Every country is a little bit wary about who's coming into their country right now for public health reasons. But they vary. I mean, people are seeing these large numbers, but they're not anywhere near the United States at this point. And the reality is many of them may not make it to the United States. Probably most of them won't make it to the United States. So there's a lot of media focus on this. And I think it's important to remember that, these are not people coming to invade the United States or sneak into the United States. They're coming to basically beg for the mercy of the United States. And under our laws, some of them probably should qualify to stay in the United States. They're seeking asylum in most cases. There's others who probably don't know this because they're not experts in U.S. immigration law, but they don't really have a good claim to come and stay lawfully in the United States. But I do think and the distinction there is under our laws, if you have a credible fear of persecution that you can demonstrate, if you are returned to your home country, you're allowed to stay. But you have to have the burden of proof to prove that. And fleeing extreme poverty, which is very real in Honduras, fleeing a hurricane, which I think most Americans didn't notice, but 2 hurricanes hit Honduras in the last. Sorry, those dynamics won't qualify you for asylum. But usually the people coming, they don't know the finer points of U.S. immigration law. They haven't consulted with an immigration attorney in this process. They just know that they are desperate. And, I think I'm always reminded in the Bible, and I heard a pastor preach on this once, the response of Jesus' disciples when they saw a large crowd of people was to say, like, that's so many people, how are we going to feed those people? And the response of Jesus was that he was moved with compassion. And I think as Christians, that ought to be our response to a big crowd of desperate people. That doesn't mean they're all going to be legally allowed to stay in the United States, but it's not something that we need to be afraid of. I think it's something that should be rousing our compassion and ultimately pushing us to ask that question of, well, why are so many people fleeing Honduras in particular right now? I mean, we're not seeing this from Guatemala or from Nicaragua or from El Salvador or from Mexico. It's from Honduras. And there's a combination of dramatic political instability and corruption in Honduras with the hurricanes, with poverty that's been there for a long time, but is exacerbated by COVID-19 related shutdowns, just that has brought extremely poor people to the point of destitution. And all of those are things that we need the church here to care about enough to help address some of the root causes that are happening in Honduras.
So if you're just joining us, we are talking with Matthew Soerens, who is with World Relief, who's a supporting partner of Women of Welcome. And we are talking about the headlines that we are seeing and that we're most likely going to be seeing over the next couple of days, the next couple of weeks and months, and why we're not afraid of those headlines and why we're going to just prepare you to engage in some of the conversations that I'm sure will be shared around, headlines that will be shared around. So we're talking about caravans right now. And one of the things that Matt just pointed out is that caravans are a group of traveling people. They're not inherently scary things. We talked about that's not a way that you would sneak into any country. We've talked about how there's a lot of push factors involved with certain caravans that are coming. And particularly those that we're hearing about right at this moment with Honduras right now is that a couple of things. One, they've had 2 hurricanes this last fall. Poverty and corruption is exacerbated by the COVID situation that's happening there. And then I would also just say that at any time that there's a new administration in the United States, there is this renewed hope that policies will change, the level of compassion will also change, and therefore I have hope to get forward. I was watching a news story the other night where a woman who was traveling with 2 of her children in the caravan from Honduras, and a reporter asked her, so why are you coming? And why are you making this really dangerous trek with 2 young children? And she said, I cannot find a job in my country. I cannot afford to feed my family. We're starving. If we stay, we will die. And so I have heard on the radio that Biden said that he will be taking a different policy approach towards immigrants. And I'm hoping that he cares enough about me. That's what she said. And my heart sank because there's probably not a solution for her if she were to travel all that way, as you were saying, seeking asylum, you have to have a credible fear of those things that you mentioned. And that's not necessarily what she has. While her situation is dire, that's not necessarily going to allow for her to come into the U.S.
Yeah.
So anything else you want to say about caravans before we move on to the next headline?
I mean, that's such a good point, Bree. And I think 2 things. One is it's important to know there are people who really should qualify for asylum who are in these caravans. I mean, I think I have a friend named Douglas. He was a youth pastor in Honduras, and he was part of the caravan that was in the news I believe it was in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. It was, a couple of years back now. It was a big news story at the time. And he got to the Mexican border. Again, he didn't try to sneak in. He went up to the port of entry and said, "I'd like to request asylum." Under the policies at the time, he was made to go wait in Mexico for many months. He actually helped start a shelter in Tijuana for women and children. And eventually he got his court date, and he was one among relatively few who was granted his asylum. And it was in part because the persecution he was fleeing was tied to his faith. He was a youth pastor who was so good at drawing kids and young people out of gangs into Jesus that the gangs didn't like that very much, and they were threatening his life. And in part on that religious persecution charge, he won his asylum claim, although I'm embarrassed to say our government is appealing the judge's decision. So he's currently lawfully in California. But that is to say, it's important that we give everyone that fair hearing. At the same time, one of the solutions to this dynamic, in addition to addressing the root causes, which our government can do, but also individuals can be a part of, and churches, is we ought to have more functional processes for lawful migration closer to Central America. So if you actually meet the definition of a refugee, there would be a way to have that claim verified without making a very, very dangerous journey all the way to the U.S. and having to go through several borders and come on an airplane, which is how the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program works. And that is one of the things we've heard that the Biden administration is going to be looking at, and we hope that they do. And also, not just for those with a good refugee claim fleeing persecution, but when we have jobs in agriculture in the United States, I mean, one of the reasons we've seen a really dramatic decline in unlawful migration from Mexico in particular in the last couple decades is an increase in the number of worker visas, where there's a job available in the U.S. and then you can go to the embassy in Mexico and request a visa to come, again, lawfully on an airplane in an orderly fashion, of course, going through a background check. And if we had more of those options for Central Americans as well, I think you would see a lot less of this desperation-fueled and very dangerous migration journeys.
Right. Okay, so again, if you're just jumping in, we're covering 4 headlines that we anticipate that you're going to be seeing, that you shouldn't be afraid of, that we're not afraid of, that we're going to address right now, and hopefully equip you to have good and healthy conversations when you see those kind of headlines being shared around all your social platforms. So the first one we just covered with caravans, and we will post this later so that you can see this on our profile tomorrow and on our Facebook page. But the second thing we're going to cover is inevitably every time there is a liberal administration that's coming in, you have a Democratic administration that's coming in, there's always this conversation of the borders are now going to be open borders, and there's a real concern about border security and just letting everybody in. So I will say that before I really became engulfed in this issue, that was one of the things that I just anticipated. Like, I was going to enter this room with a lot of people who had a lot of progressive ideas about immigration. And one of them was just to open up the floodgates because America has a lot to offer and we shouldn't be afraid of it. And yet I was shocked that even in a room with lots of liberals, a lot of progressive thinkers, not one of them mentioned open borders as a legitimate policy that they were pursuing. So when we hear okay, the Biden administration is probably going to be opening up the floodgates, what should we really be critically thinking about that? Is that a legitimate concern that we should have?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I'd be surprised if there's a member of Congress who supports the idea of open borders, that is to say, unlimited, unregulated immigration.
Right.
I mean, there are some political philosophers who like that idea on the far left, and then also on the libertarian end of the right, which is let the markets decide who comes here, absolutely no government role at all. I mean, that would be kind of a straw man position. The actual position of most people on, Republicans and Democrats in DC is, of course, we have borders. Of course, we want to keep anyone who would be seeking to do harm from coming in. And so it's really a question of, I mean, everyone agrees we should have secure borders. It's how do you get there? So there's lots of disagreements on, was a wall the right way to do that? So President-elect Biden has said he was going to stop border wall construction, apparently tomorrow.
That worries people. That legitimately worries people.
Now, he hasn't said he's going to take down the walls that are already there. And frankly, a bunch of those walls were built under the Obama-Biden administration and under the George W. Bush administration as well.
Right.
The Trump administration did a lot of fixing up old walls, but there was relatively little new wall constructed. And I would say I'm not someone who has a strong, I think walls are kind of ugly, and I don't think they're the best technology we have for border security. in the 21st century. But, I think I've talked to Border Patrol agents who have said, in an urban area, having a barrier doesn't actually stop everyone from getting over who's desperate, but it slows them down so we can apprehend them. And I think that makes sense. Most of them would also say it doesn't make sense in many other parts of the border where, it's a rural area where the geography itself keeps people from sort of absconding into the United States. But again, I think it's what we do expect to change is not that there'll be, the Border Patrol is not going away. In fact, the Secretary of Homeland Security nominee, Alejandro Mayorkas, was asked today in his hearing if he wanted to get rid of the Border Patrol or ICE, and he said no. I mean, those might be kind of the fringe positions, but he said those have really important functions. I think, we'll continue to do all we can and should do all we can to apprehend people trying to come into the country unlawfully. But I think, again, most people don't realize is in the last several years, the trend has gone from people sneaking into the country to go do a job or whatever to looking for the Border Patrol agents to request asylum. They are not, when
submitting themselves to the process.
Right. They're trying, now they may not understand the process well, but they're actually trying to request permission to come into the United States and presenting the best case that they have. Now, they may or may not qualify under our laws, but that, that's not opening the border. It's actually enforcing the laws that we have, going back to the Refugee Act of 1980, which allows anyone, whether you are at a port of entry or if you cross the border unlawfully, that entry may be unlawful, but you still have a lawful right to request asylum under the Immigration Nationality Act, as amended in 1980 with the Refugee Act. So there's, nobody's talking about open borders in a serious way. There's lots of talk about that on, cable news, but I don't think that's any elected official's serious position is unlimited immigration or unregulated immigration.
Right.
The question is how much legal migration is appropriate, on what basis, whether for humanitarian reasons or for, let's just take the people with who have medical degrees or PhDs, or just people who are coming to a reunited family, or some combination thereof, which is how our current system is, but still pretty limited.
Right. Okay. So again, if you're just joining us, we're talking about headlines that you're going to hear, we anticipate you're going to see, and why you don't need to be afraid of those. And we're just talking about 4 specific things that we think are coming up. We're anticipating are coming up. Some that have already come up. We just talked about caravans. You can go back and listen to that. We just talked about open borders and border security. And then we also, we're going to move into the third thing, which is people's concern about catch and release is, kind of what they call it. So whenever you have a Democrat who's elected, as President-elect Biden is, people start to talk about open borders, and they start to talk about catch and release. And so we're just going to let people in and release them, and then no one shows up for court dates and things like that. So we've kind of dispelled the myth about open borders. And tell us a little bit about kind of the myth around the catch and release, and why we don't need to be afraid of that kind of narrative that we might see.
Yeah. So the idea that's sometimes called catch and release is basically, it's a question of what happens when someone shows up, let's say either at a port of entry, so they haven't come into the country unlawfully at all. They just showed up at the port of entry, or they have crossed the border unlawfully and they're looking for the Border Patrol agent or are apprehended by the Border Patrol, and they say, I want to request asylum. And so then the question is, well, what do we do with them? What was long the general practice in the United States was one of 2 things would happen. One was you might be detained, which is to say you go to a jail-like facility and wait there till your court date. And that's certainly especially true if there's any sort of criminal issue or any reason to think someone's a public safety threat. And I think when there's a reasonable reason to think someone's a public safety threat, that's appropriate. But in the vast majority of cases, that's not actually the concern. It's more used as a deterrent to keep people from coming and requesting asylum and being able to wait in the United States while they're waiting for their court date, which is the other option. You're held for a little while, you're vetted, and presuming you're not a public safety threat, rather than having the government pay to house you in a kind of jail-like detention facility, we'll let you go live usually with your family. Most people have some extended family member who they can rely on, or let a church take care of you. There's no governmental assistance for these folks, but they can rely basically on private charity or family support until their court date. That latter option of being released into the United States pending your court date is sometimes sort of derogatorily called catch and release. Now, the misconception, I think, is, well, then you'll never actually see those people again. They don't show up for court. Actually, court records from the Department of Justice, which have been obtained by the Syracuse University Track Project, show that well over 80% of families who have requested asylum do show up for court. And actually, 99% of those with legal counsel. So if people had access to lawyers, they're almost certain to show up for court. Even when they don't show up, sometimes it's that they didn't get their notice or they just didn't understand, where they were supposed to show up and when. But, there are also, that's partially because people are trying to follow the process. It's also, frankly, because there are alternatives to detention. It's not just catch and release, see you later, go into the United States. Often adults are given an ankle bracelet with a GPS tracking unit. So if you don't show up for court, ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, knows exactly where to find you and will come and pick you up, and you've lost your chance to request asylum at that point. So people have strong incentives to show up for court, and that's also, it's both fiscally, I think a much better use of tax dollars for American citizens, and it also is much more humane, and especially when you have children involved. I mean, it's one thing when it's single adults, and I don't think detention is appropriate in most cases there, but a lot of these cases, it's a mom and children, and detention is just never a great situation for children. And so we should minimize detaining kids, whether they're unaccompanied children, and there's a process for that under the law, how they're usually turned over to family after, vetting, making sure we can find a safe sponsor. The government's responsible for that. Or it's a family unit together, a mom and kids, or sometimes a dad and kids. So my view is catch and release is it sounds like it's not a very nice term. It makes people sound like fish, basically. But
Right.
the idea behind it is, well, if we have no reason whatsoever to think that this person's a threat to society, they're not, they don't have criminal issues. It's a mom and a baby. Let's let her sister, in Seattle or Baltimore or Chicago or wherever, take care of them until they can go to their court date. And I would say one thing that we can do, and we're hearing this as part of the immigration reform proposals that I think would be positive, would be to let those court dates happen sooner. Sometimes these court dates are scheduled years out in advance for an asylum case. And the problem there is primarily there's just not enough immigration judges. I mean, there's been studies that the U.S. government could save a ton of money on detention if we would invest a little bit more money in hiring more asylum adjudicators and or immigration judges.
Right. And then you also have the challenge of, okay, so now you've had these folks who've started a life, if your court date's a year or two out, you start a life, your kids have been in school, you've seen what kind of life you can provide for your kids, and how heartbreaking to be told, yeah, you don't qualify, you need to go back to living in poverty and in corruption and all of these other things. It's just devastating. It's almost quite cruel. So again, if you're just joining us, we're covering 4 things. Headlines that we anticipate you'll be seeing that we're not afraid of, and that we want to equip you to just have nuance about and be able to talk with others about. So we cover caravans, open borders, and border security, this catch and release that people talk about all the time that can come up with progressive elected officials and whatnot. And then the last thing that we would just want to talk about is, there is a lot of conversation about with this new administration. Biden is saying that in the next, in the first 100 days, he's going to propose an immigration reform policy. What's in that? I mean, have you been able to take a look at that and see?
Well, he's saying within the first day he will be introducing an immigration reform policy. So, it is, for those watching a recording, it's Tuesday night.
Yeah, let's hold
the day before inauguration. So, I have not seen the legislative language of the bill, and I don't know anyone who has seen that. So the details matter in this, but the broad strokes of what we have been told to expect, and I'm not revealing any secrets here, this has been in press reports. It will be an immediate opportunity for people who have DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, to apply for a green card. Mm-hmm. And then, like anyone else with a green card, several years later, they could eventually apply for citizenship. The same for those with TPS, which is temporary protected status. So for people who currently have TPS, that's primarily people from Central America, Salvadorans and Hondurans, some Nicaraguans, also some Haitians. Most of them have been here, at least from Central America, for at least about 20 years now, living lawfully for 20 years. So again, to speak of people who, you can debate whether we should have been renewing temporary protected status and calling it temporary for 20 years. But once you've been doing so, these people have been following all the rules. They subject themselves to a criminal background check every few years. They're authorized to work, but they're not eligible for most sort of like public assistance. So they're self-sufficient. And we've said for a long time at World Relief, well, at the point that they've been here that long, and for the Haitians, it's more like 10 years. It was the earthquake in 2010.
Right.
Let's let them have an opportunity to apply for permanent legal status, and then eventually they'd be eligible for citizenship. So that's one element we understand as part of this proposal that I think we're really supportive of at World Relief. Another element of the proposal is a broader legalization process. So not quite as generous because it's for people who are unlawfully in the country, but it would basically say if you go through this background check, you pay back. Again, I don't know all the terms of exactly what's going to be required. And that's, those details will be something we're watching carefully. But there'll be some sort of process to go through. And then you would get 5 years of temporary, sort of provisional legal status, which would allow you to get work authorization and work. And then it would be a 3-year process beyond that when you'd be eligible to apply for citizenship. So an 8-year process before anyone would be eligible for citizenship, but that would be a possibility down the road. Again, we're not clear yet on all the details of what's included in that legalization. Some past proposals had some sort of a fine involved, which, from our perspective, World Relief is an appropriate way to acknowledge the violation of law and sort of uphold the law while also being compassionate and keeping families together.
Right.
So we'll have to wait and see what that looks like in the actual bill text. And then there's some elements around border security and border management. And what I haven't heard of is a significant change in how our legal immigration system works, which I think would be appropriate.
Need an update.
Yeah, there's a lot of updates needed there as well. But the other dynamic, the president, as anyone who remembers sort of 8th grade civics will know, the president actually doesn't introduce legislation. He's working with a member of Congress, more than one member of Congress, who will introduce a bill. And then there are committees to consider this. And while I'm really, enthusiastic that the president-elect is committing, he committed during the campaign to make this I think he said a first-day priority or first 100-day priority at one point. Seems like he's going to do that, but that's just a very, that's a vision for what this could look like. Then it goes to Congress. And frankly, what we need Congress to do is more important. There's some things the president can do on his own. And there's some things the new president can undo on his own that have been done by the current president. But big changes like allowing anyone to become a citizen of the United States would require legislative change. It requires the House and the Senate to both pass the same bill and get signed by the president. So it's a very positive step for the president saying he's ready to sign a bill, but it is going to take a lot of advocacy on those senators, those House members on both sides of the aisle. And they're both going to have to make some compromises and some concessions to find the consensus that they can get behind. Basically, you need 60 votes in the Senate. You need 218 votes in the House of Representatives. And I don't think that's impossible. I think we have the best chance of seeing that happen that we have had in more than a decade that I've been working on this. But I've also been working through enough failed attempts under President Bush, under President Obama, to know that it is far from a sure thing, just because the president says he wants it. So I'd encourage people to, get involved in advocating with your senators, with your members of Congress, letting them know we want a bipartisan solution on immigration. That's something World Relief has been outspoken on. I know Women of Welcome joined in a statement even today in the New York Times with an incredibly broad range of business groups and law enforcement groups, sheriff's departments and police chiefs, pretty much every big business I could think of, saying we really need a bipartisan immigration reform. So it can't just be the Democrats, it can't just be the Republicans. They need to find a way to come together. And the good news is more than 70% of voters in the 2020 election said they want some sort of an immigration reform with that earned legalization component for those who are undocumented, including the vast majority of Biden voters, but also half of Trump voters said they wanted that. So there's actually a lot of commonality on that point.
Right. So, what we're hearing is that there would be an emphasis on border security. And like you said, they're not looking to do away with ICE or Border Patrol or the security measures of vetting people coming into this country. What they're trying to do is fix some of the broken pieces. And yet there is still another step that is needed, and that is creating effective pathways that are good for U.S. citizens as well as our neighbors who are seeking opportunity and a life for their family. So this is good. What else have I not covered? I know those were kind of the big 4 things. Is there anything else where you're like, you know what, we're probably going to see this as well, and don't be afraid of it? Anything else you can think of?
The other area where we expect some changes, hopefully pretty quickly, would be refugee resettlement. Most people know the refugee program has gone down to almost nothing in the last few years from, it was about 100,000 refugees who came in 2016 calendar year, and down to, the last calendar year, it was fewer than 12,000. And some of that was COVID related, but most of it was actually a distinct policy decision set before any of us had ever heard of COVID by setting the refugee ceiling down to a historic low of 18,000. At the moment, the refugee ceiling was set by President Trump in October at 15,000, which is yet another historic low. but there's historical precedent for a new president to change that mid-year. So President Trump actually did that in 2017. President Clinton did it in the 90s. So I think, and I hope that we'll see President Biden follow through on a promise to raise the refugee ceiling to 125,000. And if that sounds like a big number to people, on one level it is compared to 12,000 or
where we are.
And but it's not totally crazy. I mean, in 1980, when President Carter signed that legislation and the U.S. had a much smaller population, the refugee ceiling was set at 231,000. President Reagan set it above 125,000. President George H.W. Bush set it above 125,000. So this is not outside of like a historic norm. It's a little bit higher than we've seen in a few years, but in some ways that can make up. I mean, we've had so many families at World Relief who've been waiting for family reunification who have been shut out in the last several years. And while we're scrambling to rebuild our capacity to serve as many people as well as we can and looking for new church partners and donors to help make that possible, we're also really excited to be able to be there at the airport when families who have been kept apart for a long time are able to embrace once again.
Yeah, and I mean, even that number, when we think about that number, we're still only taking in less than 1% of the world's vulnerable displaced people who need for countries to be welcoming and open to providing
less than 1/2% of the world's refugees at 125,000. I mean, there are 26 million refugees in the world, so it's a huge increase compared to the dismal numbers it has been, but it's not. It doesn't mean we don't need to address the root causes or work with refugees in other parts of the world. But for those who, for it means reuniting a family, it makes a huge difference. And it also gives us as American Christians this incredible blessing to interact with people who've experienced lives so different than ours. Many of whom are persecuted Christians who I think, frankly, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, have a lot to learn from people who've been persecuted for their faith and are finding new opportunities and freedom in the U.S. Others who are not Christians but have a lot to teach us as well about resilience. And I mean, there's lots of opportunities for the church to live out those commandments that Jesus gave us to love our neighbors as ourselves, which in Luke 10, it's pretty clear, doesn't just mean people who share your religion, because it was a Samaritan helping a Jewish person. Living out opportunities to make disciples of all nations. As we love people well, we get to point people to Jesus. And so we get really excited about that at World Relief, and we're always looking for new partners to help us do more of it, and grateful for the government, opening up, hopefully. We'll be critical of the Biden administration if they don't follow through on the commitments they've made. But they expect to raise the refugee ceiling. I don't know if it'll happen tomorrow or, how long it'll take, but in the first several days, we'd expect it to go up. And a number of other changes to facilitate refugee resettlement.
So that brings up another kind of thing that you could see. Again, it kind of goes back to security and whatnot. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of I don't know, say conservatives or evangelicals kind of bought into the narrative that we don't have proper vetting of refugees that are coming into the United States. I mean, if we see this number increase and we see kind of the staffing bolster to allow for more vulnerable people to come into the country, can you just explain real quickly the vetting process for someone who would be coming into the U.S. as a refugee? Because it's incredible what these people have to go through, and the waiting period, in my mind, is just insane.
Yep.
But for those who are saying, well, all of a sudden we're just going to lift this Muslim ban, all of a sudden we're going to let in a bunch of people that we don't know. Again, that can kind of make your blood pressure go up. Again, we're not afraid, and you don't have to be either, because rest assured, we have a very strong vetting process. Matt, can you tell us just a little bit about it?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's really important that we start with we're not afraid, because God tells us not to be afraid. And God's command is do not be afraid because of the thorough vetting process of the U.S. government. It's because we have a God who's bigger than anything that could hurt us. And God basically is telling, when the Good Samaritan stops and helps someone beaten up on the side of the road, it's not because he was assured that road to Jericho was now fully safe. It was because he was loving his neighbor as himself. That said, it turns out that welcoming refugees is incredibly safe, because our government, to their credit, and this is an appropriate function of government, I think, as we see God has ordained government, has established an incredibly thorough vetting process for refugees. I mean, that's not just my opinion. That's the testimony of our government, but also of independent monitors like the Heritage Foundation or others coming from a conservative perspective, who have said this is the most thorough vetting for any category of visitor or immigrant coming into the United States. So it's actually just irrational you know, you shouldn't be afraid of other immigrants either, but this unique fear of refugees doesn't make any sense when they are the most thoroughly vetted of any immigrants coming into the United States. That
Right.
vetting process involves a whole bunch of different parts of our federal government, including the FBI and the National Counterterrorism, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which actually has officers who go around to different parts of the world, the refugee camps, and do in-person interviews, often multiple interviews, background checks, retina scans. You know, we sometimes hear politicians say, well, we have no idea who these people are. And the irony for us at World Relief is we get this stack of information about every refugee.
We know exactly who they are.
And all sorts of details about their personal life. And if there was any doubt that this was not the right person, that they either don't legally qualify as a refugee, or they could in some way present a national security threat or a public health threat. I mean, everyone is being, you know, is doing a COVID test now before they get on an airplane. And this was, you know, before COVID, they were doing other tests as well, tuberculosis and all sorts of other things. Those people are very thoroughly vetted. And the best evidence that that's working is that since the Refugee Act was signed in 1980, there has been more than 3 million refugees resettled to the United States from a diversity of religious backgrounds and countries of origin. And not a single one of them has taken the life of an American citizen in a terrorist attack. Now, we should always, you know, that's not to say we should stop, our government can stop paying attention to vetting processes. That's an appropriate and important role that our government has. And I'm grateful for the officers of the Department of Homeland Security who have a really important job. And there's always ways to strengthen that process. That's also a reason that, you know, when we say the president-elect Biden will likely be raising the refugee ceiling, that doesn't mean 125,000 refugees will arrive tomorrow or next week. Because that means, I mean, you have some people who have already begun that vetting process, but frankly, the current administration has really pulled back even on doing the vetting overseas. Like, they're not interviewing people at the same numbers that they would be doing if they were planning to bring in 100,000 refugees a year. Right. So it's going to take a number of months, maybe up to a year. I'd be actually very surprised. So I think 125,000 is a worthy goal that really establishes American leadership again in terms of refugee resettlement. I have very little expectation that we're actually going to resettle 125,000 refugees before the end of the federal fiscal year on September 30th. I do think it'll go above 15,000 though, and I think that's worth celebrating, and I think it can grow in the years to come as they rebuild what they call that pipeline, which usually takes from the time a refugee is even considered for resettlement, which again is something less than 1% even being considered. It's usually going to take 12 to 18 months before they complete all the security checks, all the medical exams, and the various other dynamics that they need to pass through.
Right. So again, these are really complicated and complex issues, but there is truth to be had in them. And there are statistics and facts that back up kind of where we are, and that we can hold both of these things of being a safe country and being a compassionate country in the same hand, and to do that well. So Matthew, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Matt and I were just like, I hope we get our kids in bed on time so that we can just jump on.
I'm pretty impressed that my children have not stormed this room in the last half an hour or whatever.
I was thinking the same thing. So thank you all for joining. We will post this tomorrow, and I assume that, you know, World Relief will share this as well. We'll put this on our Facebook page as well. But again, this is what we covered, the headlines that you're about to see that are upcoming. And Matthew did a great job equipping us on a lot of these issues that I think can stir some angst in us, but that we don't need to be afraid of. And as Christians, we can bring to the Lord in prayer and enter in well in this space to honor him. So thanks so much, Matt. We'll see you all later.
Thanks, Bree. See you later.